Robert Baratheon had once found glory on the battlefield, hammer in hand, bellowing the names of the gods as he broke the lines of Targaryen loyalists. The memory of that final confrontation at the Trident stayed with him, rushing through his blood whenever he recalled Rhaegar's breastplate shattering beneath his blow. Yet now, seated upon the Iron Throne, he felt an unfamiliar unease gnawing at his heart. The war had been won, the crown his, the Targaryens cast down, but rumor and secret alliances spoke of lingering pockets of loyalty throughout the Seven Kingdoms. Grand Maester Pycelle's whispers of ravens arriving from Dorne, talk of roving hedge knights loyal to dragon dreams, and the sly suggestions of certain courtiers all fanned the coals of Robert's suspicions. He had thought the measure of his steel and the loyalty of his lords might be enough to keep the kingdom safe. After all, a young Viserys and his sister Daenerys had fled far across the narrow sea. The throne was secure, or so Robert insisted to himself when his mind drifted to more pleasant thoughts. Hunting, feasting, drinking with old friends. Yet these days, his council spent more time speaking of masked treachery than open celebrations. Targaryen loyalists in the countryside, they said, rumored to be raising secret shrines to a lost dynasty. Sel's words crossing the sea, drawn by gold and promises of a dragon's restoration. Even the uncertain loyalty of some highborn houses gnawed at him. The Rock was secure under Tywin Lannister. The Reach had bent the knee, but a few still recalled the Tyrell banners floating beside dragon sigils in years past. As for Dorne, Elia Martell's blood had not been forgotten. A single decisive stroke was needed, men whispered. Something to sweep away the last vestiges of Targaryen power and rid the realm of insidious supporters. Robert was no subtle schemer, and the slow poison of doubt was draining what patience he had. Torn between the demands of a throne he had never truly coveted and the ghosts of a rebellion he had once relished, Robert brooded upon the necessity of a new crusade. And as the whispers grew louder, an unexpected suggestion found eager ears. If the Targaryens had once warred with the faith militant in ages past, why could not Robert enlist their righteous zeal to finish what he had begun on the Trident? The High Septon in Old Town had remained publicly cautious but privately resentful of the Targaryens, who had once subdued the faith by the sword. With Aerys gone and King Robert upon the throne, the possibility of restoring the faith militant, now that the dragons were seemingly scattered, became a compelling idea among the devout. Robert had little love for the finer points of religion, but he was not blind to the power the faith wielded. For centuries, the Targaryens had either wooed or stomped them into submission. With Robert's ascension, a chance to gain the open support of the pious had arrived, and the High Septon, whose name was a well-guarded secret behind his many titles, saw a path to restore the faith militant to an official standing. Perhaps, this time, they would not fail as they once did under Maegor the Cruel. It began with a simple proposal laid before Robert by his small council. A royal decree re-establishing the warriors' sons and poor fellows under the crown's protection. These faithful warriors, hand-picked by Septons, would uphold the king's peace, root out heresy, and confirm that the old Targaryen influence was truly purged. Robert listened with half an ear until the words, "Purge all Targaryen loyalists," rang in the Red Keep's throne room. The idea stirred him. He had wanted an end to the threat, a final blow that would ensure no silver-haired pretender rose to challenge him. If the High Septon and his fanatical followers could do the work that his lords might shrink from, especially in Dorne, then so be it. The notion of a holy war under his banner began to tempt him greatly. Some members of his council eyed the suggestion with concern. Jon Arryn, his mentor and friend, looked troubled. Eddard Stark, summoned south from Winterfell, voiced caution. The Starks of Winterfell had always believed in a sense of justice more tempered than blind vengeance, even if they had fought valiantly to depose the Mad King. Varys the Spider, from his seat at the small council, tried to mask his thoughts, but the shift in his expression told of deeper ripples across the realm. But Robert heard only the promise of absolute victory. The faith militant would not simply stand guard in the capital. They would make a grand show of scouring the land and unmasking Targaryen partisans wherever they hid. The High Septon himself traveled to King's Landing to give voice to the faith's renewed vigor. A stout man with a dignified presence, He extolled the righteousness of cleansing the land of Targaryen heresy. He spoke of the old atrocities that Targaryens had committed against the faith, from the times of Maegor to the Mad King. He painted the exiled Viserys as an unholy abomination, the spawn of an incestuous line who had no claim to the Seven Kingdoms. With each sermon he delivered, the people in King's Landing cheered, growing intoxicated with the promise of deliverance from the lingering threat of dragonfire. Robert, who had never taken such devotions too seriously, nonetheless found himself enjoying the pageantry. It was an easier path, he thought, than orchestrating secret murders. Now there was a chance to enact royal justice with the proud blessing of the gods. When the decree was formally signed, the bells of the Great September rang out in triumph. The High Septon anointed Robert Baratheon with holy oils, proclaiming him the savior of the faith. The faith militant was reborn. The warriors' sons, clad in gleaming mail, with 7 pointed stars etched into their armor, stood in disciplined lines, brandishing swords kissed by septons. Alongside them, the poor fellows, drawn from common folk full of fervor, wrapped themselves in faith and wore 7 pointed stars carved from wood. They marched under new banners that showed both the crowned stag of House Baratheon and the 7 pointed star. People spoke reverently of a king chosen by the gods to wipe away the last vestiges of the dragon. Robert arranged for the faith militants' support with a simple promise. He would provide the funds and authority to move through every lord's domain, if the High Septon would encourage the realm to see him as the champion of the faith. Each side believed they held the advantage. For Robert, it was a means to rid himself of conspirators without having to rely on the delicate loyalties of local lords. For the faith, it was a chance to regain an armed, undeniable presence in the realm, to stand as a power that even kings must respect. The first wave of purges began quietly enough, in the Crownlands and the Reach. Small septs sent word of traveling hedge knights rumored to be seeking out the exiled Targaryens. The warriors' sons arrested them, and with no need for a trial by the king's justice, they were cast into dungeons or executed after swift confessions. It was not long before merchants in the markets whispered of men vanishing overnight. It was rumored that these knights had only sought honest wages, but their fates were sealed by the faith's suspicion. Cersei Lannister, the queen, watched the developments with cool satisfaction. As far as she was concerned, any measure that consolidated Robert's hold on the throne, and thus guaranteed her children's positions, was to be applauded. Yet there were some in the Red Keep, like Eddard Stark, who could not shake an uneasy feeling. Ned recalled the old ways, how the North had never truly bent knee to the faith of the Seven. The old gods still reigned in the heart of Winterfell's godswood. This militant arm of the faith, now armed and sanctioned, stirred an apprehension he could not put into words. It was not the same righteous battle against the Mad King that had united the realm before. Instead, he saw an emerging system of terror and fanaticism that might bleed the innocent along with the guilty. But Robert, grown weary of the day's toils, brushed his old friend's concerns aside, muttering only that it was time to finally wipe out the last Targaryen supporters once and for all. The next phase of the Purge stretched southwards, to the storm-lashed coasts and fields of the Stormlands, Robert's ancestral seat. The faith militant demanded that all lords of the region swear fresh oaths to renounce any remnants of Targaryen loyalty. Most did so readily, more out of respect for Robert than the faith. Yet houses that had once fought on the side of the Targaryens bristled under the decree, even if they had bent the knee after the rebellion. They resented the intrusion of septons in mail scrutinizing their ledgers, questioning their maesters, and rummaging through their histories. The seeds of discontent began to spread, watered by the imposing presence of warriors who claimed to speak for the gods. Stannis Baratheon, Lord of Dragonstone, displayed a stony acceptance of his brother's edict. Dragonstone itself had once been the Targaryen seat, and the faith militant arrived to weed out any old loyalties among the servants and fishermen who lived upon the dreary isle. Stannis allowed them free rein, though he disliked their presumptions. He was a hard, humorless man, but even he sensed that these armed septons were something new and dangerous in the kingdom. Still, he kept his misgivings private, seeing no point in challenging Robert while the younger brother, Renly, was at storm's end. taking delight in the theatrics of the faith. All the while, ravens flew to and from King's Landing, carrying the fearful news of what was happening throughout the realm. In the Vale, Jon Arryn attempted to temper the faith's fervor. He refused to allow them absolute authority to detain or interrogate any who might be rumored loyal to the Targaryens without proof. This caused a rift between the hand of the king and the High Septon, who began to view Jon as an obstacle. Pressure mounted on Robert to strip his old guardian of his interference, though Robert hesitated. He owed the man too many debts of gratitude, but his frustration grew. The purges, in his mind, were not meant to be hampered. Word reached Dorne that the Faith Militant were on the march, and the water gardens of Sunspear stirred with heated debate. Prince Doran Martell, still nursing the wounds of the rebellion, recognized this as a threat and an insult. It was widely known that Dorne had suffered the brunt of Targaryen downfall. Princess Elia, sister to Doran, had been butchered along with her children by Lannister men. The memory festered like an unhealed sore. Now came the Faith Militant, brandishing the stars and hammers of the Seven, determined to root out Targaryen loyalty in a land that still mourned the downfall of House Targaryen's Dornish princess. No matter how carefully Doran had navigated the realm's politics since the war, he knew that the Faith's arrival would incite the anger of his people. And so, as the Faith Militant caravans crossed the bone-dry passes into Dorne, led by warriors' sons under the direct blessing of the High Septon, they found cold welcomes. The Dornish lords refused to open their gates, citing the king's peace but also demanding that any royal delegation show more courtesy than an armed band of inquisitors. Letters went back and forth. The High Septon insisted his men had every right, under royal command, to seek out traitors. The Dornish demanded that any man found trespassing on their lands without leave from their prince would be seized. Tensions climbed rapidly. In King's Landing, Robert roared with frustration when these tidings reached him. "Are they not part of my realm?" he demanded. "Do they flout my authority so openly?" He saw no reason for Doran Martell to obstruct the Faith Militant, and the High Septon's letters of complaint painted the Dornish as unrepentant Targaryen sympathizers. In the eyes of many at court, Dorne was the last major harbor for Targaryen dreams. Whispers claimed that if Viserys Targaryen returned, he would land in Dorne first to rally an army. That was enough for Robert, who ordered more men be sent alongside the Faith Militant to enforce the decree. The newly formed alliance between the Crown and the Faith turned official corners of the realm into a place of quiet fear. The small folk, initially stirred to cheers by the idea of cleansing traitors, soon realized that mere gossip could condemn a neighbor. If your enemies whispered that you had toasted the dragon once, or that you had named a dog after Rhaegar in jest, the Faith might come knocking. Though the High Septon himself never condoned brutality in his official pronouncements, the local chapters of the Warriors' Sons and Poor Fellows had broad license to interpret any rumor as heresy. In the Reach, Mace Tyrell played the loyal subject, but privately he worried. His family had once supported the Targaryens, and though they had bent the knee quickly to Robert, some distant cousins or knights sworn to Highgarden might still harbor Targaryen sympathies. If the Faith Militant uncovered any minor pockets of rebellion under his watch, House Tyrell's loyalty to the new order might be questioned. Thus Mace cooperated vigorously, providing fresh horses and supplies, guiding the warriors' sons to every sept, and overseeing the questioning of any suspect. He prayed that this show of cooperation would be enough. In the west, Tywin Lannister watched with a cold, measuring gaze. The Lannisters had orchestrated the end of the Targaryen heirs in King's Landing and delivered the bloody proof to Robert. They had little reason to fear an inquest into hidden loyalties. If anything, Tywin saw in the Faith Militant a tool that might be used to stamp out any last vestiges of Targaryen supporters on a grand scale, reinforcing the alliance between House Lannister and the Crown. Cersei encouraged her father's perspective, seeing in the Faith's crusade a justification for any heavy-handed punishment of potential rivals. She was always ambitious, always eyeing the advantage that might arise from chaos. As the Faith Militant gained momentum, its zeal took on a life of its own. Local septons and knights formed new chapters, championing the cause with fervor that often outstripped their instructions. Processions carrying relics of long-dead saints paraded through dusty villages, proclaiming the dawn of a holy age under the Baratheon king. Some fanatics began destroying Targaryen symbols whenever they saw them. Ancient tapestries, dragon-shaped carvings on old halls, even family crests that bore some tangential link to dragons. A handful of outrages occurred in the Crownlands, where rumored Targaryen bastards were dragged from hovels and paraded through the streets. The small council, upon hearing these tales, shifted uneasily, but Robert remained resolute. He wanted fear sown in the hearts of any traitors. Across the narrow sea, Viserys Targaryen fumed. Even at a young age, word reached him through the sailors of Bravos and Pentos that Robert Baratheon had launched a holy purge. He saw it for what it was, a final blow to extinguish the Targaryen flame. Though exiled with his younger sister, Daenerys, and reliant on the charity of magisters and merchants, Viserys nurtured his bitterness. The name usurper became a curse on his lips. If ever he returned with Sellswords and, ideally, the help of the free cities, he vowed to make the Baratheon usurper pay. But for now, locked away in foreign courts, Viserys found no immediate means to oppose the purge. The mercenaries he approached demanded gold he did not have, and the fear of the newly resurrected faith militant reminded potential backers that Westeros's new king was not to be trifled with. Meanwhile, Daenerys, still a child, barely understood the significance. She only felt a nagging sadness and longing whenever her brother ranted about their lost birthright. Her quiet tears in the night reminded the exiled Targaryens how far they had fallen. No matter how heated Viserys' threats became, they remained in a perilous position, reliant on the pity or ambitions of others. No Sellsword company would join them merely out of nostalgia for dragon banners. The news of the purge only deepened the sense of isolation for the last scions of House Targaryen. Back in King's Landing, the High Septon continued to preach from the grand pulpit of the Great September, praising King Robert and damning the Targaryens. He retold stories of how Aegon the Conqueror had subdued the faith, how Maegor the Cruel had butchered the warriors' sons, how Aerys too had burned his own subjects. In these sermons, the faith militant was cast as an avenging arm of the gods, working hand in hand with a righteous king. The crowds cheered, and a new wave of common folk, enthralled by the pageantry, joined the ranks of the poor fellows. They marched out of the city gates in clusters, singing hymns and brandishing makeshift weapons, determined to root out any heresy they might find on the roads. For Eddard Stark, the uneasy feeling grew into a quiet dread. He watched the small council with a grim face as the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, Barristan Selmy, reported a rumor that some Dornish caravans had been attacked by these roving bands of poor fellows, all in the name of rooting out Targaryen loyalists. Innocent travelers were being inconvenienced or worse, yet Robert dismissed the events as unfortunate excesses. The king was far more engrossed in a fresh petition from the High Septon, who argued that the old Targaryen sigils still woven into certain tapestries of the Red Keep should be removed. Robert barked a laugh, recalling how Aerys' entire line had been extinguished save for 2 children across the sea. But he waved a lazy hand and allowed the faith to tear down the offending tapestries if they pleased. Jon Arryn attempted one last time to counsel moderation, warning that the faith militant were not sworn to serve merely the king but also the High Septon. If left unchecked, they might carve out a sphere of authority that answered to no one but the gods they claimed to represent. He reminded Robert that Maegor Targaryen had once faced a bloody struggle with an empowered faith militant. Robert listened, but his frustration flared. In a rare, heated argument, the king told Jon Arryn that times had changed, and that the Targaryens had been usurped precisely because they did not bend to the will of their people. If they had let the faith be, perhaps the dragons would still reign. Now it is my turn, and I will not make their mistake. Despite his reservations, Jon Arryn yielded to the king's will. Eddard Stark grew more disquieted but found his pleas falling on deaf ears. He considered returning to Winterfell, but Robert valued his presence, if only because he could trust Ned to speak plainly. The North remained far from the center of faith's power, and for now the purge had minimal impact on those who kept to the old gods. Ned feared what the future held when such fanatics were let loose upon the realm. At the same time, the Lannisters tightened their grasp on the Red Keep. Cersei reveled in the heightened sense of dread, for it made her father's seat of power more secure. The faith militant, though nominally loyal to the High Septon, relied on the crown's funding, and the crown relied on loans from the Lannisters. Gold was needed to supply these newly sanctified warriors, to feed them, arm them, and keep their morale high. Tywin made certain that the Lannister gold kept the alliance afloat. In return, the faith treated the West with relative leniency, rarely harassing any Lannister bannermen. As the Purge approached its second year, tension simmered everywhere. The Crownlands were thick with the faith's presence. The Stormlands were policed heavily by the Poor Fellows, a situation that Renly Baratheon found both amusing and exasperating. The young lord enjoyed the pageantry but disliked the haranguing presence of so many devout fanatics interfering with his social amusements. Stannis, meanwhile, had little taste for the faithful zeal that overshadowed his seat at Dragonstone. He endured it with grim acceptance, making sure none of them stepped out of line, while sending cold letters to King's Landing warning of potential abuses. Robert rarely read them in detail. It was Dorne that threatened to ignite into war. The faith militants' repeated attempts to force entry into sun-swept forts triggered skirmishes, not full battles. Dornish spears and bows, unleashed upon the unprepared Poor Fellows, left bloody remains in the desert sands. The warriors' sons, more disciplined, found themselves outmaneuvered when they tried to handle cross-border raids. Each bloodshed escalated the rhetoric at court, with the High Septon declaring that Dorne was shielding traitors, while Prince Doran shot back that the faith had no authority over matters in his domain without his leave. When word reached King's Landing that a party of warriors' sons had been wiped out to the last man near the Prince's Pass, Robert's rage exploded. He demanded that the Lords of the Reach send men to Dorne to secure the pass and arrest all who had participated in the slaughter. Mace Tyrell complied, though with obvious reluctance. His bannermen marched alongside the faith militant, bracing for resistance. Thus, an armed host crossed into Dornish territory, many bearing the Star and Stag banner. Prince Doran, who had remained patient in the face of repeated provocations, now girded himself for open confrontation. He insisted that if the faith militant did not respect Dornish sovereignty, they would find the desert full of hidden foes. In a matter of weeks, the once quiet boundary between the Reach and Dorne teetered on the brink of open war. The faith militant, proud in their cause, demanded surrender from any suspected Targaryen loyalists. The Dornish, remembering Elia Martell and her murdered children, had little desire to submit to what they viewed as a foreign occupation. Raiders loyal to House Martell targeted supply lines, ambushing the baggage trains of the star-cloaked Poor Fellows. In response, the warriors' sons launched punitive raids into villages suspected of harboring archers. A cycle of violence and retaliation ensued, overshadowing any claims of a holy cause. Robert, meanwhile, watched from the Red Keep, seething. He had assumed that the Purges would break the will of the Targaryen loyalists quickly, that the memory of the dragon's fall would cow them. Instead, his kingdom in the south threatened to erupt into flames again. Each raven from Dorne brought word of skirmishes, and the faith militant demanded the king's support in crushing Dornish defiance. Some in the small council urged caution and negotiation, but Robert refused. He considered the Dornish stance a personal affront, a sign that Targaryens might still find a foothold if not stamped out. As tension escalated, the High Septon fanned the flames with declarations that any who resisted the faith militants' lawful searches were, by definition, heretics. He did not openly call for war, yet his words left no other path. The lords loyal to the crown were forced to choose sides. Mace Tyrell, facing pressure from his bannermen who bled in the deserts, increasingly supported more force against Dorne. The Dornish, refusing to be dictated to by zealots, dug in deeper. Cersei Lannister, reading the changing winds, urged Robert to crush Dorne quickly lest they become a base for any Targaryen return. Ned Stark could almost feel the moral ground crumbling beneath his feet. He had not fought a rebellion alongside Robert only to see the realm threatened by holy terror. Yet Robert, so full of anger at the slightest mention of Targaryen defiance, refused all talk of peace. The faith militant had become a juggernaut, unstoppable and thoroughly enmeshed in the crown's authority. Jon Arryn's heart grew weary of conflict, and the Old Hand tried one last diplomatic mission, sending an envoy to Sunspear to parley with Prince Doran. The envoy was greeted politely but returned with a stern message. So long as armed fanatics roamed Dornish lands, the Dornish would fight to protect their people. The presence of Targaryen loyalists, Doran insisted, was a pretext for subjugation. If Robert wished to avoid a second rebellion, he would need to reign in the faith. The king's next decision altered the course of the realm irrevocably. Urged by the High Septon, Robert declared that any region refusing the lawful authority of the faith militant was in open rebellion against the crown. He demanded that Dornish lords open their gates, present suspects for inspection, and swear new oaths. If they refused, they would be treated as traitors. The memory of the Field of Fire and the subsequent conquests by Aegon Targaryen loomed in many minds. The last time Dorne was forced to bow to an outside power, it had taken decades of guerrilla war and negotiation for them to join the realm. Now, threatened again, the Dornish prepared for the worst. War ignited in the southern sands. The faith militant and the forces of the Reach marched under banners displaying the stag and the seven-pointed star, forging deeper into Dornish territory than any force had since the days of the Targaryen conquest. Prince Doran unleashed skirmishers to harass supply lines, using cunning ambushes and the punishing heat to wear down the invaders. Castles closed their gates, while local lords mustered levies. The High Septon proclaimed a holy war against Targaryen loyalists, but on the ground, it felt more like a war of conquest against a proud land. All the while, Targaryen sympathizers across the realm watched with bated breath. Some secretly cheered for Dorne, hoping that a Baratheon defeat might pave the way for Viserys' return. Others trembled, for the faith militant was emboldened by the conflict, arresting suspected traitors in the Crownlands for fear they might sabotage the war effort. Lannisport grew tense with rumors that certain merchants had once funded Targaryen coffers. King's Landing swelled with refugees fleeing the conflict, each bringing horror stories of raids and forced confessions. Eddard Stark, though wary of the faith's zeal, marched south at Robert's command, compelled by his sense of duty to the crown. The Northmen were not enthusiastic about a campaign in Dorne, but Ned led them honorably, hoping perhaps to mitigate the worst of the violence. Jon Arryn stayed behind in King's Landing, his health declining. He had grown old, and the strain of witnessing the realm slip toward chaos weighed heavily upon him. Varys the Spider whispered to him, lamenting in hushed tones how the faith was growing too bold. Littlefinger, ever opportunistic, saw new ways to profit from a war-torn land by manipulating grain prices and coin flows. Cersei replaced the absent Ned on the small council's daily meetings, shaping policy in ways that advanced her family's power. In the field, the combined might of the Reach and the faith militant forced its way through several key passes. Scorching Sun and Dornish bowmen exacted a toll, but the disciplined ranks of the warriors' sons pressed on. Lords of the Reach who had fought in Robert's rebellion relished another chance to prove their valor, though some found their hearts heavy at the thought of fighting fellow subjects of the realm. The faith's leadership declared each Dornish holdfast that resisted an affront to the Seven, fueling a cycle of atrocity and retribution. Hostages were taken, septs were burned in retaliation for Dornish ambushes, and the roads became littered with the dead. Robert himself rode at the head of the army. He had never lost his skill for battle, and for a brief time he even felt alive again, his warhammer swinging. The desert heat wore on him, though. The knights found him drinking more heavily, bellowing in anger at the mention of Targaryen loyalists, and ignoring the pleas of Ned Stark to show mercy. When some warriors' sons executed a group of Dornish prisoners on suspicion of Targaryen ties, Ned confronted Robert in his command tent. The ensuing clash of words nearly ended their friendship. Robert shouted that the Dornish had brought this upon themselves, sheltering traitors. Ned saw only the faces of men who had surrendered, murdered in the name of the faith. Their bond frayed under the weight of that argument. Dorne fought with a passionate ferocity. Even as the faith militant advanced, they left behind pockets of stiff resistance. The roads were too dangerous for supply wagons, forcing the invaders to forage. The local population, loyal to House Martell, vanished into the hills or the deserts, leaving nothing behind but scorched fields. Guerrilla tactics whittled down the poor fellows, whose religious fervor was no match for Dornish cunning and local knowledge. The warriors' sons, better organized, managed to secure a chain of small keeps, but the cost in blood was high. Letters to King's Landing became increasingly desperate. In the Red Keep, the High Septon insisted the war was just urging Robert to send more men. Tywin Lannister, ever calculating, offered gold, but refrained from sending a large portion of Lannister troops south. He had no desire to risk his own men in a desert quagmire. Instead, he allowed Cersei to guide Robert into deeper war. She, too, kept Lannister involvement modest, trusting in the Tyrells to bear the brunt of the fighting, with the Faith Militant as a fanatical spearhead. The Lannisters, as always, came out ahead so long as others paid the price. Near Sunspear, Prince Doran struggled with gout and the heartbreak of seeing his people suffer. He had known that open war was possible, yet he had hoped that stalling tactics might force Robert to the negotiation table. Instead, the Faith's fanatic leadership refused compromise. Messages from King's Landing demanded unconditional compliance. War seemed the only option left. House Martell's forces, commanded in large part by Oberyn Martell, the fiery Red Viper, fought with skill and venom. The war turned personal for Oberyn, who still carried the memory of his sister Alya's brutal end. Stories reached the front lines of Oberyn dueling multiple warriors' sons, leaving them gutted in the sand. The Faith declared him a demon in human skin, reviling his quickness and cunning. The conflict escalated, flaring into pitched battles. The poor conditions in Dorne exhausted the invading forces, who also battled disease from fouled water. Still, they managed to push close enough to threaten a siege of Sunspear itself. But Prince Doran had prepared for such an eventuality. The outer fortifications, combined with knowledge of the terrain, bogged down the Faith's approach. Ambushes, night raids, and sabotage of water sources hammered the besiegers, whose fervor began to buckle under unrelenting attrition. Many among the warriors' sons began to question whether the gods had truly commanded this bloody crusade. In King's Landing, the High Septon tried to maintain morale by proclaiming each new day would bring the righteous victory. The small folk, once enthused by the idea of a holy purge, now saw the endless streams of wounded soldiers returning from the south, and their cheers turned to unease. Rumors abounded that the war had grown savage, that Targaryen loyalists were not the real enemy, and that the realm was paying a heavy price for Robert's alliance with the Faith. Bread grew scarce, especially as trade routes were disrupted by the mobilization of men and ships. There were even claims of men in the city giving secret shelter to Targaryen agents, though no proof was found. As the war dragged on, Robert refused to yield. His pride and the memory of how the Targaryens had once threatened his life propelled him forward. The High Septon, seeing an opportunity to further consolidate the Faith's power, pressed for greater authority in the capital. He claimed that heretics lurked in every corner, but more gold and men were needed to flush them out. Jon Arryn, on his deathbed, pleaded in vain for an end to the madness. When the hand finally passed away, the realm lost one of its few moderating voices. His funeral was overshadowed by war, though Ned Stark mourned him deeply, seeing the collapse of everything they had once fought to build. With Jon Arryn gone, Robert named a new hand, a pliant lord from the Reach who strongly supported the Purge. This was the final blow for those in the council who had any hope of guiding Robert toward peace. Under the new hand's council, more crown resources were poured into the war, more levies raised, more fervent calls for men to join the Faith Militant. The Lannisters continued to lend gold, securing a stranglehold on the realm's finances. Tensions flared in the Riverlands, as some lords grumbled that they could not keep sending men south without ruin. But no one dared openly defy the king. As for the Targaryen cause, it remained a distant specter, yet it found new life in the chaos. Secret envoys crossed the sea, reaching out to Viserys in Pentos, offering him glimpses of possible support if the war in Dorne weakened the Baratheon king enough. Although most of the lords were too fearful to openly rebel, a few lesser knights and disaffected lords in the Stormlands, the Crownlands, and even the Reach whispered that they might support a Targaryen restoration if it promised to end the war and curb the faith's successes. Viserys, flattered by these secret messages, postured grandly in foreign courts, though his resources remained meager. Still, the word dragon began to hold a tantalizing allure once more among those oppressed by the militant inquests. On the front lines, the war rolled into a third brutal year. Ned Stark, heartsick, continued to lead his men, seeking to protect civilians where he could. He had come close to open confrontations with the warriors' sons who tormented suspected heretics. More than once, he threatened to cut down any knight who dared harm unarmed prisoners. Rumors circulated that Ned had saved a group of Dornish smallfolk from execution, an act that made him popular among them. Oberyn Martell, hearing of Ned's reluctant participation, wrote him a letter suggesting they might broker peace if Robert would only recall the faith militant. But Robert refused to hear any such talk. The turning point came at a place known to history as the Red Dunes, a swath of shifting sands beyond the usual roads. The faith militant, under the direct command of a zealous knight called Ser Lomas of the Seven, attempted a flanking maneuver to trap Oberyn Martell's forces. Yet Dornish scouts lured Ser Lomas into a wide expanse of desert with little water. For days, they shadowed the faith militant's columns, cutting off any foraging parties and leading them astray with false trails. By the time Ser Lomas realized his error, his men were dehydrated, exhausted, and filled with despair. Oberyn struck at dawn. The Dornish cavalry and infantry pounced upon the faith militant. In the swirling red dust, the knights could not form proper ranks. Their rousing hymns turned to anguished cries as wave after wave of Dornish spearmen closed in. Ser Lomas fought valiantly, but his lines crumbled. The scorching sun and sand-laden winds completed what Oberyn's spears began. By midday, the faith militant was shattered, leaving thousands dead or captured. The Red Dunes ran crimson with the blood of warriors who had marched in the name of the Seven. When news of the catastrophe reached Robert's camp, it was like a punch to the gut. Dozens of noble knights from the Reach had perished, as had many revered warriors' sons. Robert cursed the Dornish, cursed the faith for their miscalculation, and cursed the day he had allowed this holy purge to spiral into war. The entire offensive, now lacking the fanatical heart of the faith militant, faltered. Mace Tyrell urged retreat, citing the mounting losses and the resilience of Dornish defense. Ned Stark quietly agreed, seeing no possible victory that would justify the bloodshed. But Robert, stubborn to the last, demanded one final attempt to take Sunspear. The attempt never came. The battered forces that remained had little will left to fight. The harsh conditions, the demoralizing defeat at the Red Dunes, and the lack of supply lines sapped all resolve. Even the warriors' sons who had survived were shaken, their faith battered by the horrors they had witnessed. In the end, reality prevailed. A negotiated truce was arranged in which Robert agreed to withdraw the faith militant from Dorne, while Prince Doran agreed not to harbor any overt Targaryen agents. Both sides recognized this was a hollow peace, a temporary standstill. Dorne remained defiant, and the faith's pride had been deeply wounded. Robert marched back north with the dregs of his army, a pale shadow of the man who had once emerged triumphant from the Trident. The war had left him bitter and exhausted. The purge that had begun with such fervor, a righteous vision to rid the realm of Targaryen loyalists, had devolved into a crippling conflict that brought only misery. The realm groaned under the debt. The small folk whispered that the king had been misled by zealots, and the faith militant, though still powerful, lost much of its luster in the eyes of the common people who had borne the brunt of their fanaticism. The High Septon remained in King's Landing, receiving the battered survivors of the faith militant with solemn blessings. Yet behind closed doors, he simmered with resentment. For all the claims of a holy war, the faith had been humbled by the Dornish. The alliance with King Robert still stood, but cracks showed. Robert's support for the faith militant was irrevocably tarnished by the humiliations of the campaign. The king no longer glowed with the confidence that had once fueled the purge. Instead, he drank more, bellowed at his lords, and avoided the Great September as often as he could. The rest of Westeros looked on, shaken. The noble houses had seen enough bloodshed in the rebellion, only to witness an even more senseless war spurred by religious extremism. Trust in the faith eroded, especially outside the crownlands. Many lords who had welcomed the faith militant before now found them an unwelcome burden, a reminder of the realm's near collapse. Some quietly expelled them from their lands, while others refused to supply them. Citing debts and war fatigue, they demanded the crown reign in the faith's privileges. And so, from a position of near unquestioned power, the faith militant began to lose the wide support it once enjoyed. In Dorne, the tales of the war were recounted with a sense of proud defiance. Ballads told of Oberyn Martell's triumph at the Red Dunes. The Dornish dead were mourned, but they had won the moral victory against an invading force that claimed to be fighting in the name of the Seven. Doran, however, took no joy in the devastation that had ravaged his land. He sent discreet messages to potential allies outside the realm, ensuring that if Viserys ever returned with an army, Dorne might yet lend assistance. The seeds of a future uprising against the Baratheon regime were planted. For the Targaryens across the sea, the war had provided an unexpected boon. The realm had bled itself in a foolish crusade. Word spread that King Robert's rule had been deeply shaken, and that many lords no longer trusted his judgment. Viserys boasted that the day of his return was drawing closer, though in truth, he was still short of funds and reliant on the generosity of magisters and sellsword captains. Yet the prospects for a Targaryen restoration, once laughably small, had improved. The fear of a righteous purge had turned to cynicism about Robert's use of the faith as a weapon of state. In King's Landing, time passed, but the scars lingered. The faith militant, though still formally recognized, found its membership diminished. Many poor fellows had deserted or returned to their homes, leaving only the most ardent zealots in the ranks. The warriors' sons licked their wounds, rewriting the narrative of their defeat as a test from the gods. Some still roamed the crownlands, arresting suspected traitors, but their presence caused more resentment than respect. Merchant caravans avoided them, lords refused to quarter them, and the High Septon's pleas for greater tithes fell on deaf ears. Robert, for his part, sank deeper into a life of indulgence, haunted by the ghosts of the war. Though outwardly he remained king, boisterous and given to feasting, many who knew him saw the emptiness in his eyes. He had embraced the faith militant to secure his throne against Targaryen loyalists, and in doing so, he had unleashed horrors upon the realm that nearly tore it asunder. Friends became distant, old alliances fractured, and the realm bore new resentments that would fester for years to come. In private moments, he sometimes confided to Ned Stark that he wished he had listened to him, that this holy purge had brought nothing but blood and ruin. Ned, still the loyal friend, assured him that they would rebuild. Yet he too sensed that something intangible had broken. The memory of what had happened in Dorne, the revelations of how easily men could be swayed by holy fervor, and the knowledge that Targaryen loyalists might yet remain in the shadows cast a long shadow over the Red Keep. The realm carried on. Trade resumed, knights jousted in tournaments, and lords schemed for advantage. But the illusions of a stable peace under Robert Baratheon had been shattered. And so it stood, a wounded realm with a disillusioned king, a chastened faith militant, and a populace battered by war. The Targaryen cause, once thought nearly extinct, discovered a faint resurgence in hope. Dorne, battered but unbowed, waited for a day of reckoning. Ties of friendship and loyalty had frayed in the fires of fanaticism. The Iron Throne remained Robert's seat, but the question lingered whether he truly ruled or if the realm might yet slip through his grasp at the next crisis. Had he refused the faith's entreaties at the beginning, perhaps the Seven Kingdoms might have enjoyed a lasting stability. But Robert was no statesman. He was a warrior at heart, prone to follow the promise of decisive action, and in that fatal choice, to embrace the faith militant, to turn zeal into a weapon. He had turned his once celebrated reign into a precarious, bloody chapter of Westerosi history. The official purge ended not with the triumphant extermination of Targaryen loyalists, but with a realm more bitterly divided than before, set upon a dangerous course that would echo long into the future. a warning of how easily righteousness can twist into tyranny when wielded by the hands of men.